Okay, many thanks, Frances. That's an excellent response. Can I invite the other panelists, Nick and Christina, to come to open up the video so we can see you. We've got a really good set of questions coming in. They always come in towards the end of the presentation, so we've got loads to talk about. I know, Christina, you've been able to answer some of them already, but there was one question that seemed to get a lot of interest around the data, how much data was collected on the survey participants. I know you've already started to answer it, but could you just say a little bit about that? Because there was a lot of interest in that question.
Yeah, we obviously collected sort of socio-demographic information, which is all in the report as well. The entire questionnaire is listed at the end, but we have somewhat nationally representative data in terms of age, gender, income, and education level. So it's easy to look at those. I think also region, but it's not in the report, so I'll have to double check with Kat. I don't know, Nick, if you know, but normally that would be a quote as well. But we also asked some other questions at the end about home ownership and children in the house and so on. So there's a bunch of stuff we could look at. As far as I know, again, Nick, you can say if I'm wrong on this, but we haven't done any detailed analysis that's written up in any way looking at how these variables affect people's responses, because we asked a lot, but we'd be interested to know what people particularly want to know, what type of responses and the effect of sort of socio-demographic variables on those.
Yeah. And obviously there would be a point where the data set will be in the public domain. It's not currently, and obviously people will be able to do further analysis on that data set around various variables. I mean, we had the question about regions interesting. Yes, I think we have got regional data, and we were having this discussion with Welsh Government, and we'll have the same one with Scottish Government. I think we can give a seminar up in Scotland in 2 or 3 weeks' time. My experience is with very little variation that climate change beliefs tend to be shared across the 4 nations of the UK in a similarish way, and that's probably because we're all reading the same media, we're all subject to the same influences in producing that template or that mental model of what climate change is about. So I've always been very surprised. We didn't do oversampling in Scotland and Wales this time. We do sometimes do it, and when we do it, you often get almost identical questions. We've re-looked at the very small samples we've got for Wales and Scotland, and there doesn't seem to be a huge difference from the overall sample results. So the region doesn't seem to do much, and I think sometimes socio-demographics tend not to do much. The one thing we should be able to look at is political affiliation, which we know in America hugely polarizes. In an odd way, in America, a majority, up to 70%, think climate change is happening and it's an important thing, but there is a very small but significant minority, primarily on the right of the political spectrum, but not entirely, who think climate change is not an important problem or think it isn't happening. We don't have that in the UK in the same way. I think you probably agree with me, Christina, knowing all the data from Yale and elsewhere. But you do tend to get tend to get a mild political effect in a similar way, and I could state the parties, but I won't do it in a previous survey we did, and there was a clear ranking from Green through to, I think it was the UK Independence Party, whoever it was on the more right-wing side of things. But yeah.
Okay, we've got a large number of questions. I'd really encourage people to use the upvoting thing, because that really sort of helps to get a sense of what people really want to hear answered. I've got one here about how respondents relate to, I guess, respondents to the survey relate to known impacts to their own lives, and that's critical. Like, so water management has negative property level and upwards. It doesn't seem to be part of the set of actions that climate action groups consider. Yet flooding is seen as a major risk. Is that because they consider this to be the duty of government?
Do you want to go on that one, Christina? Yeah.
I think there's a lot of literature on why people engage in sort of individual action to kind of prepare for flooding or become more resilient, which I have to add, I don't know all the ins and outs of it, but I think from our data and from what I know, I think generally people do look for government and sort of local authorities to at least help with that. So have adaptation policies and sort of flood prevention policies. I do know also it depends somewhat where you are. I know of a study, for example, that has done comparative work in different regions, and depending on what sort of the relationship was with local government or the perception of the Environment Agency and so on, it can change whether people are willing to kind of prepare themselves in addition to also trusting that the government has done their part. So it's a little bit of a give and take. But yeah, I mean, I think certainly we know that people see government responsible for these things.
Okay. Any response from you, Frances, or shall I move on to the next one, which is directed at you? So the next one's about, is DEFRA not meant to develop strategies and policies, i.e. act on this report, rather than simply be interested to see things?
It's a good one. I think I was alluding at the beginning just to the our kind of 5-year statutory cycle for developing policies on adaptation. So this particular report comes at a really good time in terms of influencing the next cycle of our next national adaptation programme, which will be launched in 2023. And so we've got a big kind of evidence gathering process happening now with the climate change risk assessment evidence report being compiled for publication next year. So these findings will come at a really good time to inform that, although it's not one of the formal projects under that, it's part of the wider evidence base that can influence that report. And I'm sure that Nick, you're in conversation, very well linked up to authors on those studies. And then what happens is that government, our next national adaptation programme, will respond to those kind of priority risks highlighted in that climate change risk assessment. So it will feed in. There's just a bit of a kind of process for gathering everything together and responding. But I think there are already things that we can do now in terms of some of the communications messages, I think, are already very relevant and things that we can start factoring in.
Thank you. All right, here's another one. Do you think from the results that the public appreciates that both mitigation and adaptation both need to avoid impact? So in particular, is there evidence that people appreciate that even a 1.5 degrees C world will need adaptation to avoid the residual damage?
Sorry, were you trying to? Yes. I think one of the things that I haven't shown, we did some experimental work in the survey with some additional participants, and we were trying to get over a very high warming world against a 2-degree world, and that was actually quite difficult to do. And I think, and I'm not really laying any evidence there, I'm just saying it wasn't in a way successful. As successful as a core part of the survey. So I think there's a huge challenge, which is there's a conversation starting as well amongst climate communicators, Met Office, CCC, DEFRA and others, about if we're going over, if it's likely we'll go over 2 degrees, then how is that going to be communicated? And I don't think we know the answer to that question yet. Because it's difficult. It's about the dynamics of the system. It's about time. And we actually quite struggled at the, Christina, I'm sure will reinforce this, at the design stage to really come up with a good set of scenarios which showed different types of climate change, their impact on the UK and what that would mean for people. So there's still a big outstanding challenge about 2 degrees and beyond 2 degrees, which we fear might happen, even though we hope won't happen in the future.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Right, so there's a question here about where participants source information about the perceptions of the urgency of climate change mitigation and adaptation. So, and other than from their own personal experiences of extreme events. So, investigate that in the survey? Like where people get the information from beyond personal experience?
I think the short answer is no. But we do know that, so if you're asking a question about urgency, for example, it's sort of people's general impressions of climate change and what's going on, and generally those relate to various things. So it might be their personal experiences or generally sort of public discourse on the issue, which to some extent that might be media, but it could also be talking to sort of friends and family and so on. I don't know, Nick, if you wanted to say anything else, but I presume, I mean, I know this from some other studies that, you know, people have been paying attention to the kind of heightened discourse around climate change that is going on, or that was going on at the time. Extinction Rebellion was also prominent at that time. So I think that probably drives some of that, but we don't know from this data set.
No, we didn't ask that one. But it's interesting, isn't it? You wouldn't, Extinction Rebellion have done, or the climate protests have done a lot in terms of, that's pretty clear, in terms of influencing the media. Other things have been going on in the background. I mean, the BBC, interestingly, in the last year or so, has really changed its policy on climate reporting. And it no longer puts a climate skeptic alongside a scientist to debate out the science, which was always a contestable thing to do. But so there's been a subtle change in framing around the media in the UK. But the heat thing is interesting because you would think, well, the climate protests aren't particularly focused on heat. Actually, they're more on, although there is an adaptation side to it, it is more on getting on with mitigation rapidly. So heat has probably clearly come from what's been reported about the heat impacts around the world, and some experience as well of UK heat impacts being reported in a major way in the UK media. So that you can start to interpret where some of these different influences may be impacting on the results. But Christina's right, we didn't ask where you get your information from. And so I wouldn't want to speculate on the answer to that one.
Right, okay, thank you. Right, there's a question here. If the adaptation policies support questions have been framed more like mitigation policies, so increased taxes to spend on flood protection, nature protection, etc., would they be closer to mitigation policies support numbers? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. I'm not sure about that. The survey wasn't specifically designed to ask that question really about the economic trade-offs, although we had those two because we tracked them about taxes on previous surveys. I think that's another research project, so paying for adaptation. My guess, if I were to guess, I would say because adaptation is more concrete and can be framed in a more local way. So these are things that happen here. So you're putting in a flood protection scheme in Cardiff if you need one, or in London, or in Leeds, it would be a good example, wouldn't it? Then probably you may well find less skepticism about where the taxation is going and what it's being done for, and of course the question on mitigation. There are really questions about consumption, which challenge some very deeply held values and beliefs that we have in Western society about the right to do X, Y, and Z, and to consume in a certain way that's been sort of presented as the standard Western lifestyle over many, many years. And I mean, there's a lot of debate about how that needs to change. So I think they are very different questions. Then I wouldn't predict exactly the same answer there. But it's a further research question, I think, an important one.
Yeah, and just to add, I think the one that received the lowest amount of support is obviously increases of electricity prices, and electricity prices are kind of a sore subject anyway. So to be honest, I think the answer to that question is probably, I mean, I would guess yes to some extent, with caveating it with what Nick just said, because adaptation actions are different and they don't directly influence people's lives like increase in electricity prices, but it would depend on the type of policy you're talking about as well.
Right, so this is the final question. So what role should or could the government play in increasing perceptions, understandings, values and judgments? It seems that there's a mismatch between scientific evidence of severity of impact and versus investment in risk perception by the government. Do you think this is the case?
Can I
have, or do you want to?
No, we've got about 1 minute.
Go on, Frances.
Okay. I think yes. I mean, and I can't say. I think perhaps COP will be a really good test case for what we can do in terms of the outreach and the engagement question, and then kind of build from that. Because I think perhaps the different messages have been quite disparate, and I don't know if there's been a specific attempt to try and change beliefs and perceptions as opposed to kind of using them to inform policy action. But I definitely know that government's very interested in using kind of research programs to do some more deliberative work on action pathways. So there might be more to see on that, but Nick, I don't want to, you might want to add something.
Well, I'll just throw something in terms of the current experience that a number of people have been trying to assist the UK government and the devolved administrations around COVID risk communication. And it's pretty clear, you know, there's been a lot of scrambling. It's not anybody's fault at all to try and catch up. The poor old comms people have got a huge problem that has landed on their desk for solving tomorrow or the day after or the day after, as the situation is changing. So probably some thinking in advance about pandemics and risk communication could well have helped that process get off to a slightly smoother, and certainly would have helped the comms people understand and the various people who are involved in policy changes. And so I think climate change is a bit like that, isn't it? There's a sense in which, like the pandemic a year ago, nobody really thought about it hugely, even though you'd know it was sort of a risk, and therefore there probably wasn't a lot of government investment in this area. And then suddenly when the crisis occurs, it's needed. And so there's a bit of a mismatch there. I mean, some of us, sorry, I will finish, Kate. Some of us argue there's a need for sort of almost a climate risk communications centre, which has existing capacity sitting there, but it would look at lots of different risks and would help stakeholders as and when an issue arose, but would have the capacity and the knowledge, which we don't have. So with COVID, we've been trying to reinvent it all from the published literature. And I think with climate change, we've got an opportunity to be ahead of the curve.
Great. Okay, many thanks. So I've noticed that quite a few of the questions have actually been answered, and so all of the text answered questions will go on the YouTube site. We might be able to twist your arm to answer some of the remaining unanswered questions, and quite practical ones about infographics and things. So hopefully we can respond to those questions. So yeah, now just to thank you all our speakers, and thank you for everyone for your questions. It's been a really interesting webinar. I've just noticed Kat's just joined. But I hope everyone enjoyed the discussion. And just to share finally just to say a little advert for our next webinar, which will be in a couple of weeks, with speakers from the Met Office, Simon Brown and Dan Cottrell, on the statistical analysis and attribution of impact-relevant climate extremes. And so the recordings and slides from today and the questions will be on our YouTube site and be put up in the next few days, and you'll get everyone who participated today will get a link to that. So on behalf of the Champion team here at Leeds, many thanks again to the speakers for all your insights, and thank you for everyone for their participation, and I hope we can connect again soon.